Up next, remarks from Republican Senator Rand Paul at the National Conservative Student Conference. Senator Paul talked about the state of the conservative movement, last week's health care vote, and the Justice Department's use of civil asset forfeiture.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I have 3 boys, and I've actually got one of them with me tonight, William Paul. If you like Obamacare, you can keep it. Apparently, that is the Republican message. If you like Obamacare, you can keep it. Raise your hand if you want to keep Obamacare. Exactly. Nobody outside of Washington who's a Republican wants to keep it. What happened to these people? I heard them all the time. We're going to repeal it, root and branch. That sounds like all of it and then some. And yet when we got up here, we decided to vote on a partial repeal. We lost like 8 people who voted for it a year ago. Then we started getting skinnier and skinnier, and we voted on the skinny repeal. What percentage of Obamacare were we going to repeal? Maybe 20%. And we lost people on that. Some people said it was too much, the first repeal. Then they said it was too little, the next repeal. It amazes me how people with a straight face, and one Republican alternative plan said, literally, put forward by Republicans, if you like Obamacare, you can keep it. There's still one of those floating around. I just don't understand the disconnect. My father used to call it Potomac fever. People come up here and they get some sort of addiction to power, and it sort of corrupts their brain. In fact, it was, I think, Lincoln who said, if you want to challenge a man, and test a man with adversity, give them power. You know, I think that's really the problem up here, is we have so many people that succumb to it, they forget where they came from. They forget what they said on the campaign trail. Now, some people say, in order to get ahead, what we need to do is just hold hands and sing Kumbaya, and everybody just needs to be nicer. We're not nice enough to each other, everybody says up here. And occasionally that may be true. They were shooting at me at the baseball game, so some of them are not playing nice. But the thing is if we're looking to how we get along, do we have to all believe the same thing? Can you believe things strongly and still have public discourse about it? Was it always this way? People say, you know how your parents, or maybe your grandparents, my parents would say, you remember the 1950s, everything was perfect, you know? And nobody was angry, and everybody lived as this idyllic, peaceful world, and nobody was ever angry with each other. So they say in politics, oh yeah, everybody used to get along. It's incivility that is our problem. And it's like, have these people not read any of our history? Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were at each other's throat. They were accusing each other of having children out of wedlock. Andrew Jackson just finished a book about him, and they were talking about him being a bigamist and being married to a woman before she was divorced. We've had a lot of acrimony. From my state, there was a guy named Henry Clay, probably one of the most famous senators over there. When he first came up, though, he was elected to the House. This is like 1810. He gets elected, and he becomes Speaker in his first term. It's like, you know, many times these people have been up here 20, 30, 40 years until they get to be Speaker. He was elected his first term, only one ever to be elected. But it was kind of a raucous place. There were dogs on the floor. There were people, the Derringer had just been invented. It was a sliding pistol. You could have one that slid down your arm just in case, you know, people got out of hand on the House of Representatives on the floor. But anyway, there was this guy named John Randolph of Roanoke, and he had 2 big dogs. And these aren't like Labradoodles, okay? Think Game of Thrones hounds, all right? So he has these hounds on the floor, and the Speaker before Henry Clay had said, we're gonna get those dogs off there. And a guy from North Carolina, a congressman, came up to John Randolph of Roanoke and said, you need to get those dogs out of here. And John Randolph of Roanoke picked his cane up and proceeded to cane him over the head until he decided, well, it's best not to mess with John Randolph. So Henry Clay gets elected, and Henry Clay says to the Sergeant of Arms, get those damn dogs off the floor. And so the Sergeant of Arms was armed. He went over, made him take the dogs out. And so John Randolph of Roanoke was none too happy with Henry Clay. Henry Clay comes out of the doors, the same doors, same house of war, comes out of the doors, and John Randolph of Roanoke bows up and he says, "I never sidestep a skunk." And Henry Clay said, "I always do." And walked on past him. Things were not really ever, completely without acrimony. But the moral of the story, if there's a moral, we have to get to a moral. The moral of the story isn't that we should carry guns or be so unhappy that we're shooting at each other on the house floor. We don't want that. But do we want the opposite? That we have to just sing Kumbaya and not voice what we truly believe in? Are there things that truly are important enough that you should stand your ground on? I think there are, and there have been times in our history when we do. If people ask you who is a hero, and if I were to define what a hero is, to me a hero is someone who is not a man or a woman of their times, but a man or a woman beyond their times. So for example, in our history, William Lloyd Garrison to me is a hero. He opposed slavery when it wasn't popular. When everybody said, well, Andrew Jackson had slaves and Jefferson had slaves, everybody had slaves, so they were just, it was accepted. It wasn't a big deal. Well, you can argue that, but you could also argue that who were the extraordinary people who said it was a big deal, who understood even at that time. William Lloyd Garrison wrote a little newsletter called The Liberator for like 35 some odd years. And you could say, well, no, Lincoln should get all the credit. There's a great book by a guy named Lerone Bennett, and it's called Forced into Glory, and about Lincoln. I know you're not supposed to say anything bad about Lincoln, but the whole point was Lincoln kind of got there because of people like Garrison, who fought in the trenches, who fought for ideas. For so long, Lincoln was a politician. Lincoln, writes a letter at one point and says, if he can keep the Union together and we must keep slavery, he'd settle for that. So, the thing is, yeah, Lincoln did a great thing in the end, but he got there by somebody had ideas and somebody said, slavery's wrong. So we need people, I think, in every time who are trying to think beyond the moment of what the next thing we can do. And there are issues that maybe aren't the issues of slavery, but there are issues of great importance that we find. The idea of whether, babies mean anything or children mean anything. Does that mean, do we just say no big deal? The question I asked Debbie Wasserman Schultz about a year ago was, when does life begin? And, many of them say when you take the baby home. And it's like, really? So if your baby's in the hospital for a couple of months, it's not really alive? In my practice, I would examine babies that were sometimes a pound and a half. The reason I examine them for them is that when they're born really early and they get oxygen too soon, they can develop abnormal blood vessels in their eye and it leads to blindness. You almost never see it now because it's preventable. But you'll see people my age who are blind. One of the most common things is they were born prematurely. But the thing is we say, well, I'm for the right to not have red light cameras. I hate red light cameras, by the way. But the thing is to get to red light cameras, you got to be for something even more important than that precedes that. Individual liberty and rights. We got to understand where our liberty comes from. That our liberty precedes government, that our liberty comes from our Creator. And the thing is that if we don't understand that, we get confused. And then when Uncle Bernie comes along and says, he says, well, health care's a right. And it's like, well, if it's a right, then does that mean you have a right to the involuntary servitude of those who are going to give you the health care? And really, if it's a right, if you have a right to concrete items, where does it end? So here we are sitting debating Obamacare, and my side, God help us, my side decides that the only way we can replace it is to have a nearly $300 billion insurance stabilization fund. They said, well, insurance is too expensive. So what we'll do is we'll tax everybody, put it into a fund, give it to the insurance companies, and they can charge less. And so I raised my hand, which is always a danger at lunch. And I said, well, I haven't had a new car in a while. New cars are very expensive. If we could have a new car stabilization fund, that would help me. And I've got 2 kids in college. Could we have a college stabilization fund? And my kids, I don't know about any of you, probably not, it's never happened to any of you, my kids drop their phone in rivers, lakes, ponds, you name it. And iPhones are expensive. Could we not have an iPhone stabilization fund? When did it become a Republican idea to take from the general populace a tax Stick it into a fund, give it to a private company, and tell them to lower their prices. It is not Republican. It is not conservative. And that became one of the main things, and that's still what they're talking about. When they say, oh, we don't have a replacement, they want a government replacement. So we got into this debate at the very beginning, and I was on one of the television programs, and I said, yes, we should replace it at the same time, because we need to offer something positive to the people. And I would replace it with freedom. Freedom of choice, competition, legalize the sale of inexpensive insurance. But then everybody started hearing me say that, and then all of a sudden they're saying, yeah, we need replace. But it turns out we kind of disagreed on what replace was. To many people, replace was keeping much of Obamacare in place, keeping the tax subsidies in place, adding a new insurance fund, but then keeping the regulations in place. What it gets to is this. You are the next generation. You got to think through things. So, for example, what are the unintended consequences? I tell people the problem in Washington is we have big hearts but small brains. Sort of a dinosaur kind of syndrome up here in more ways than one. But the thing is people say we must help people, and so we have to let people buy insurance who are already sick. Because if we don't, we're just not good people. And then compassion is equated with money. So people just started throwing all kinds of money at every problem, which isn't Republican and really isn't truly compassionate if you destroy the country in the process. But the whole idea was just throw more money at this. And the thing got bigger and bigger and bigger. But the fundamental flaw of Obamacare is this, in one sentence. The fundamental flaw is this. If you tell people they can buy insurance after they're sick, and then you put a bunch of mandates on insurance to make it more expensive, so poor people and working class people can't afford it, and you tell them you can still buy it after you're sick, guess what happens? They wait to buy it until they're sick. Fancy name for this is adverse selection. You get sicker and sicker people, and the young, healthy people don't buy it, and it's the death spiral that is Obamacare. So what did the Republicans offer to replace it with? They said, well, we will subsidize the death spiral of Obamacare. They weren't going to fix it. And so what is the real problem here? It's like, do you think I don't care about people who are sick? People in my family are sick, very sick. I care a lot about getting people health care. I spent a lot of my life trying to help people who don't have insurance to get care. So I do care about people, but I want to do something that works. It's like this. If your house is on fire, do you call your insurance agent and say, I really need to get homeowners insurance. I forgot to get homeowners insurance. No, if your house is on fire, you call a fireman. So if you are very, very sick and have no money, we do have government health care. It's called Medicaid. We could help people directly. But if you're very, very sick and it's costing $1 million a year to keep you alive, the insurance company knows exactly how much it costs. You can't insure against that. And then you say, oh, we're going to take all the sick people and put them together in one place, and we're going to call it a high-risk pool. It doesn't work. It's not insurance. The insurance companies know exactly what it's going to cost. And so when the insurance executives came in, I said, well, if you no longer force people to buy insurance through the mandate, you don't fine them. This thing they call the individual mandate. They taxed you if you didn't buy insurance. If you don't do that, but you still tell people they can buy insurance after they're sick, guess what? It might be worse than Obamacare. We keep what was in Obamacare, but we get rid of the force. And most of us are conservatives. We don't want force or coercion. We don't want to force you to buy insurance. But if you keep the regulations in place that still say you can buy it after you're sick, people do. It just will not work. And so really the problem is, and this is true of anything, you could say, for example, that water is so important that how could we leave that up to individuals to figure out how to get water? Food is so important. Cars are so important. How could we possibly let free individuals make arrangements to buy and sell things with their neighbors? How could we possibly do that? We have to have the government involved. I'd wipe out all the Obamacare regulations tomorrow, including on pre-existing conditions. Is it that I don't care? No, the marketplace will work. What happens to those who fall through the cracks? Well, you may not have a right to health care. We have an obligation to help you. And there's a difference between that. And I think that's important for you. You'll be in these debates in college and stuff. Do you have a right to health care? No, but do you have an obligation to help people who don't have health care? Absolutely. There's a difference between an obligation and a right. Are you your brother's keeper? In a religious sense, absolutely. But is the government, should Big Brother be your brother's keeper? No. Why? Why don't you want the government to do it? Why don't I want the federal government to do it? I'll tell you one reason. One, because I think you lose your liberty in the process. But two, they're just not very good at anything. People will ask me, they say, do you think government is inherently stupid? I say, well, I don't know, but it's a debatable question. Look, they can't even deliver the mail. The post office, they haven't figured out that we have email. It's the first problem. But the post office loses $1 billion a quarter, $4 billion a year. So they came to my committee a couple years ago and they said, well, to retain good people, to have a good post office, we're going to have to pay the executives more. And so I raised my hand, which is always a problem. And I said, well, how much talent does it take to lose $1 billion a quarter? You think you got to pay people $2 million to lose $1 billion? I'll work for $500,000 to lose $1 billion. If the standard is losing $1 billion a quarter, when you look at it, there are two reasons why. There are two main categorical reasons why you would want to be for limited government, why you want small government, really at every level, but particularly at the federal level. I call it the liberty argument and the efficiency argument. The liberty argument is this. When you work and you get your check, and let's say you made $100, you put plants in or put a roof on or were doing something outside, mowing grass, and you got $100. Whose money is it? It's your labor. You traded somebody, they paid you $100. And you say, well, you're arguing for anarchy, no taxes. No, let's accept there's going to be some taxes. We're going to have taxes, and we're going to have some law enforcement and national defense and several, there's probably one or two other things we'd have. I can't remember the other ones, but we'd have a few things. We'd have a small government that does things, and you'd have some taxes. But if I told you made $100 and the taxes are going to be $90 out of every 100, would you think that I took something that was yours, that I stole the fruits of your labor, that I took some of your liberty? So the argument is this, not for an exact tax level, but for the lowest possible tax level that you can have the amount of government that we have to do things that can't be done in the private marketplace. Mostly national defense. We can have a few other things. There's very few other things, but national defense needs to be done by the government. Even entitlement programs and all that, I do it at the state level. I really wouldn't do it at the federal level. They're not very good. And they end up, I think, destroying people. What is the number one way you get self-esteem? Can someone give you self-esteem? You're the self-esteem generation. Everybody at school's been trying to give it to you forever. Everybody gets a trophy, right? Everybody's a winner, right? No, you get self-esteem by doing something. And it doesn't mean that everyone's a concert pianist. All right, somebody will be. Not everybody's an opera singer. Not everybody's a professional baseball player. Not everybody's a doctor or lawyer. But you get your self-esteem by doing things. So I think big government comes in and actually takes that away from you. You got to earn self-esteem. Nobody can give it to you. You get it through work. So I'll often tell people, I say, well, yes, we should have work requirements for welfare. Absolutely. Every able-bodied person that gets anything from government ought to have to work for it. And they say, well, that sounds so harsh. I was like, no, work's not a punishment. Work is the reward. Work is how you feel better about yourself. No matter what it is, that's where you get your self-esteem, is by doing something and producing something. But we've got to figure some of this out. We've got to figure out, what we think government should do. So the first argument against big government is the liberty argument, that if you give up 90% of your check, you're losing your liberties. You want to give up a small amount. My dad used to always say, well, the church never asked for more than 10%. He didn't think the federal government should either. It's not a bad standard. But the other argument is the efficiency argument. This kind of goes along with the post office. There's a great statement by Milton Friedman, and he said, nobody spends somebody else's money as wisely as their own. That's why government's not efficient. That and sort of that there is no profit motive. The profit motive, and this is the invisible hand of self-interest. People say, how terrible it is. What if government didn't direct all of our economic affairs and people were just selfish and they wanted more money for their family? Well, the interesting thing about it is that self-interest, trying to maximize profit, leads to efficiency. What is capitalism? Capitalism is that supply and demand curve crossing. What's the result of it crossing and finding the intersection? The most amount of goods to the most amount of people at the cheapest cost. You want central planning? Go visit Venezuela. Go visit Cuba. Conservatives are very good with the Second Amendment. That may be their best amendment, probably. And I'm all for the Second Amendment. I am very supportive personally, public, in every which way you can think. But the thing is you have to think of all the Bill of Rights as a conservative. If you want to defend the Second Amendment, you got to really believe in the First Amendment. Because without speech, without discourse, and without the ability to organize and associate with fellow believers in the Second Amendment or any other amendment, you're not going to keep it. But you also have to have the Fourth Amendment. And I spend a lot of my time trying to protect the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment says the government can't come in your house without a warrant. The warrant has to have your name on it, and they have to specify what they want. Why is this important? Because you live in the digital era. You don't even remember the era before the digital era. Everything's digital. And it's not that the government's going to come in your house and ask for your papers, because you don't have papers anymore. Post office, we don't have mail anymore. But you do have your phone. Your whole life's on your phone. And the government has no right to look at it unless they individualize. They have to put your name on a warrant, and they have to go to a third party. The third party is an independent judge. Why is this important? Because you can see how people get carried away sometimes. Japanese attacked us in World War II, and we were angry. Those people who looked Japanese or looked Asian, we got to round them up, put them in camps. We sort of forgot about jurisprudence. We forgot about justice. We forgot about individualization of whether someone's guilty. We forgot about the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. We've got to be careful. When Edward Snowden revealed that all of our information was being collected, that was a big deal. It wasn't being individualized. And I would argue that we might not be safer in the sense that if you can collect too much information, you might be overwhelmed with the information and not be targeting what you need to do. So for example, remember the Sonarif boys, the Boston bombers? Guy had been to Russia, they'd made public postings, and it's like, absolutely go after them. Go after the social media, go to the judge. If I'm the judge, call me. As much as a privacy advocate as I am, I would give it a warrant to look at any of their stuff. The guy that bombed the nightclub in Florida, you know, the FBI had information on him. He'd been investigated for a year and a half. 6 weeks before that, he goes to buy 1,000 rounds of ammunition in a gun store. They had him on video. The FBI never investigated. But I think sometimes we're getting too consumed with getting everybody's stuff instead of just going more targeted towards people for whom we have suspicion. If you travel internationally now, when you come back across the border, they can deny you admittance into the country. U.S. citizens, anybody in this room, can be denied admittance to the country unless you give your password. That's wrong. And it's one of these things that I've kind of worked on a bipartisan level to say, you know what? You have to individualize. You can't just say anybody coming across the border. You have to get a warrant. You have to ask an independent judiciary. The reason you want that is there are still people who might make judgments on either what you look like, who you are, what you do, where you're from, as opposed to saying there is a risk that this person is a criminal and there is evidence, probable cause that we should look at their stuff. When we look at our system, though, compared to other countries, I think the real fallacy is, and this is another Bernieism, we were in committee the other day, and he said, we have the worst childhood, we have the worst childhood poverty in the whole world. Are you kidding me? Have you traveled anywhere in the world? It is never good to be poor, and we do have poor people in our country. But if you compare the poor in our country to almost any other country, it doesn't even compare. Go to India, go to Central America, travel in Africa, and you'll find out what poverty is really like. So we do need to be proud of our system. But when we're discussing anything, Obamacare, whatever it is, it really is, do you want freedom or do you want coercion? Do you want big government or do you want to be left alone? But in order to argue for freedom, you have to have sufficient confidence in freedom. And so that's what I've said all along. Why do we still have Obamacare, even though they all promised us they would vote for it? Because the people who decided not to vote for it, I think, showed insufficient confidence in freedom. They were so worried that freedom wouldn't take care of people. Do you know there was a time when the church took care of people, when the government didn't do anything? I think sometimes we've forgotten this with our churches, too. We think somehow, well, the government's going to take care of them. Many churches have gotten back involved and gotten more socially active in helping poor people. But that's really it's what you're supposed to do. It's your obligation to take care of your fellow man. But I think it's also important for us to know that we live in the richest, freest, most humanitarian country in recorded history. In 2014, in 2014, we gave away $400 billion, not the government, almost $400 billion individually to our churches, to the Salvation Army, to help our fellow man, for nearly $400 billion. That's more than most countries earn in their GDP. That's probably more than 90% of the countries have in their GDP. We gave that away. That's not an accident. That came from embracing freedom, capitalism, the right to exchange your labor and your services with your neighbor. That's what it came from, the great wealth. And we've got to remember that and be confident of it. And I'll end with this. As conservatives, sometimes you will be branded as, oh, you're just for austerity, you don't want to help anybody, you don't want to give anybody anything, you know. There was a painter by the name of Robert Henry, and he said to young painters, his exhortation was to paint like a man coming over the hill singing. I like the image of that. I like the optimism of that. And what I would say is when you go back to your college and when you go back out into the rest of the United States, think about the optimism and the hope that comes from freedom, from the system that has made America great. And if you want America to be great, you got to understand why we came and how we became great. And remember the image of a man coming over the hill singing. Thank you very much. I think we're going to do a couple questions. As long as they're easy questions, they're hard questions, I'm going to make Joseph answer them.
Thank you, Senator, for coming today. I had the pleasure of meeting you. I just wanted to ask, I understand your frustration with the Republicans and not being able to repeal Obamacare, but would you be still willing in the 2018 midterms to help increase the Republican Senate majority, since now you said that there's only 52 and there's not enough Republicans to get the job of repealing Obamacare done?
I'm always, Republicans are better than Democrats, all right? I know this is a nonpartisan group, but I will tell you that there's not one Democrat that will repeal any regulation. There's not one Democrat that will repeal any taxes. But that's why we needed to do better on this, because it was only going to be Republicans repealing it. And if we'd repealed some of Obamacare, we might have actually gotten to the compromise part, which we could work with Democrats. But if you don't repeal any of it, we're sort of stuck now with nothing repealed. But yes, we need more Republicans. Really, we need more conservatives. So really, it's your job. Go out there and get some good people and send them up to us.
Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Sarab. Hi there, my name is Sarab. I'm from the University of Texas at Austin, and my question to you is kind of the opposite side of the party politics related question, which is, a lot of us in this room, we're politically active now, but not all of us want to become directly involved in politics. And how is it that we can kind of push forward the principles in your mind that that help make this country great and continue to make it great without being actively political? How do we perpetuate a system where liberty can survive without actively being involved in politics?
I think you have to arm yourself intellectually, and that's how we win the debate. So, ideas have consequences, and you have to win the debate. And so let's say you don't want to knock on doors and you don't have any local candidates you really like or anybody you feel like working for. There are other ways. There are people up here and throughout the country who work in like foundations, political foundations. There are people who work in the universities. You talk about having some influence. If you were to teach economics or political science at one of our colleges, you'll teach hundreds of kids and have influence on them. So there's education, there's that. You can also go out, and Ron, is it okay if he goes out and becomes a billionaire and then tries to help you out? That's fine too. All of that's important. I'm kidding around, but that's serious. So some people are in politics, that's one way. But some people are just very good at business, and then they want the next generation to be able to enjoy the freedom they did, and they give back. And there are a lot of people to give to YAF, and that's one way of helping as well. Then there are people who give to candidates. But I do really believe that arming yourself is most important. You have to be able to win the intellectual battle. You have to be able to win the debate, or at least be able to come to contest the debate. And that means becoming armed intellectually.
Thank you.
Hi, Senator. I'm Victor. I came from the University of Florida. I'm the one who gave you the business card. I was originally born and raised in Brazil. I got my citizenship 2 years ago, and the reason I got my citizenship is because over the years I've really truly learned to understand what it means to be an American, and I'm really prideful of that, and that's why I became a citizen. My question is, what do you think is the single most important American value that we must instill in our immigrants to learn to love this country and appreciate it?
The single most important, that's a big question.
At least one of them.
You know, I guess the thing is that there are very important attributes that we should all have, you know, religious, moral, compassion, obligation, all these things that are very, very important. But I think the thing about America that's amazing is that we're going to leave you alone to make that decision. I'm not going to make it for you. No one's going to make it for you. And we all have our different religious traditions. But the thing is that nobody's going to actually tell you that. But in not telling you that, it tends to work out that we don't descend into chaos. You know, now we have government that is part of the stability, but we also tend to all searching and trying to help our family first and then our community. It tends to work. But anytime you get the government involved at any level, it tends to distort things, and people actually tend to be poor. You know, like I say, all you got to do is go down to the neighbor of Brazil, go down there and go to Venezuela and see the horror.
Yeah. Too good.
Thanks.
But yeah, thank you very much.
Good evening, Senator. My name is Grant Wolf. I'm the chairman of the YAF chapter at SMU in Dallas, Texas. You were talking to us tonight about arguing on the basis of principles, about liberty and efficiency and things like that. I find so often, though, people don't want to engage in the discussion on principles. They say that's too simplistic or that's reductionistic. You know, how do you facilitate debate back to principles so that that's where we can win the intellect?
Well, I think it's both. You know how I said there's a liberty argument and efficiency argument? Some people will only listen to the efficiency argument, but we win the efficiency argument hands down. I mean, ask people if they want their health care to be delivered by the post office. You know, I mean, the federal government is not very good at anything. And as much as I'm a believer that we have an obligation to our veterans and that we should take care of them when they come home, the VA doesn't work that well. I mean, it doesn't distribute the goods very well. And nobody likes to say this, but the reason it doesn't work very well is it's socialized. I'd be, and we've tried to do some of this, I would be more for letting veterans have insurance to go see a local doctor for the most part, because then they actually get to be participating in a system that actually works. They don't have to wait around for eons. Now, there are good doctors in the VA, so I've worked in the VA. I don't want to say it's all bad, but the distribution is slow, the waiting times, and one of the things we've got going on right now is we're actually losing more soldiers to suicide than combat, and so you don't want, you know, to tell a soldier that it's having bad thoughts, come back in a month and you get to see the psychiatrist, you know. So, you know, we just have to realize that I think you can win on the efficiency argument that big government doesn't work very well. And, you know, if you're going to read some things, Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson I give to all the interns in my office. It's a short book, but really runs through all the liberal fallacies, you know, the broken window fallacy, Frederick Bastiat. All of these things are great to be armed with because they really fit universally a lot of situations that come up. But you're right, a lot of people you can't get through to them. You know, Constitution doesn't mean anything, morality doesn't mean anything, but doesn't mean we shouldn't still make those arguments and then also be prepared to argue the efficiency or lack of efficiency of central planning.
Thank you, sir.
Shani Howard from Utah State University. You have recently sponsored a couple bills to amend the Bill of Rights, and I was wondering if you still believe that the Bill of Rights sufficiently patrols the federal government?
If we're going to amend it, the next amendment should be you have to pay attention to the Bill of Rights and adhere to it would be important. As far as, the Bill of Rights, is awesome, but I would say one of the most important of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution is the 9th Amendment. And I'm a big admirer of Randy Barnett, who teaches at Georgetown. He's written a lot about the 9th Amendment. The 9th Amendment says those rights not listed are not to be disparaged, that really it's a partial listing. And they had to put the 9th and 10th Amendment on there because some of the anti-federalists said, well, gosh, if we list them, are people going to think that's all you've got? And so really the only way they got the Bill of Rights through was putting the 9th and 10th Amendment saying powers not granted to the federal government are left to the states and people, and rights not stated, as the 9th Amendment, are not to be disparaged. And this is pretty important, and we still have this debate, and it divides conservatives and libertarians a little bit because conservatives will sometimes say, oh, you don't have a right to privacy. It's not in the Constitution. Well, the 9th Amendment says it doesn't have to be in the Constitution. Unless the government was given a power over my privacy that is constitutional, I do have a right to privacy, and it's implicit, but it is there. Property, some of our founding fathers wanted to have a stronger emphasis on the right to property. There isn't as strong an emphasis on the word or the term in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but still most people think that we're a society based on individually owned private property. But some of the things I proposed, I think I have term limits I've proposed. What else did I propose that you're thinking of? The FAIR Act. I don't know if that would be an amendment to the Constitution, but the FAIR Act talks about civil asset forfeiture and says that basically you should be innocent until proven guilty. And if you're walking down the street with $500, the government can't just take your money and say, prove that you didn't do something wrong to get the money. This is, I think, a real tragedy. It's an area where I disagree with Attorney General Sessions because it's been disproportionately used against minorities and poor people, and it just doesn't fit with our conception of justice. It's really uniting a lot of people. I think the Federalist Society seems to be on our side on this. Wall Street Journal the other day editorialized on it. But it's a good issue, and it's also, I think, a way, like I say, sometimes conservatives are perceived as, oh, you're all into austerity, all you care about is balanced budgets. This is a very human issue, but it ought to be fixed, and I think it also is consistent with our philosophy.
Hi, my name is Mason Sanders, and I'm from Henderson State University in Arkansas. And given now that Republicans, that 3 of them are not voting to repeal and replace Obamacare, do you think that it would be a good idea to just let Obamacare fail as it will do and let private enterprise pick up the pieces and go from there?
It's a tough discussion and a tough conclusion to make. Obamacare is failing, and I think most people acknowledge the Democrats created it, and it was imperfect to say the least. I think it's a mistake to keep most of it in place and put a Republican Band-Aid on it that I don't think will work, and then all of a sudden everybody says, oh, well, Republicans couldn't fix it, and Republicans made it worse. So there is part of me that says, well, gosh, we need to make sure who was responsible for this fiasco catches the blame for this. But it's been a big debate in our caucus and in Republicans in general. Most of our caucus believes that if we don't do something, we'll be blamed for doing nothing, and it'll have great electoral consequences in 2018. I actually think the opposite. I think if you do the wrong thing, or you don't really repeal Obamacare, but you put your names and your mitts all over Obamacare, and now it's called Republican Care or Ryan Care or Trump Care, but you don't fix it, I think there's a worse danger to that. Every proposal, even the partial repeal, none of those proposals fix the fundamental problem, the fundamental flaw of Obamacare. The fundamental flaw is something called adverse selection. Healthy people don't buy it, all the sick people get in the insurance pool, and you get this acceleration of premiums. And it's a big deal. 50% of the country only has one insurer. What happens when you get one insurer? Monopoly prices. But a growing percentage have no insurer in the individual market. Now, this isn't the whole thing of healthcare. It's about 10% of healthcare, but we could fix it. I talked to the president right before I came over here. I am still pushing for a market reform that would allow individuals across state lines to join an association and to buy their insurance, having one person negotiate for them. You could be in the Chamber of Commerce, has about 5 million people. AARP has 33 million. Credit unions have about 25 million. Can you imagine the difference in price if you're an association of millions of people versus you and your wife trying to get insurance? Nobody should be stuck in the individual market. It's not really truly a a result of the free marketplace. It's a result of our tax structure from World War II that we developed this marketplace. It's a terrible place to be. So what I've been trying to do is say, let's give people an avenue or an exit out of it. And I believe that President Trump can do this on his own. And so I've recommended that they go back and reevaluate the law and start approving lots of groups to have associations. And it will help to equalize the negotiation between insurance company and individual, which I think is greatly lopsided. And actually, I think big insurance has become sort of the epitome of crony capitalism. They've got they're like every other besieger in Washington now saying, give me, give me, give me somebody else's money.
Hi, Senator. My name is Jordan from Virginia Military Institute, and thank you for taking your time to do this. My question is on your previous stances against the demilitarization of the police force. So since 2013, police fatalities have continued to increase each year, and this year they're already up 18% from the previous year. So I was wondering, given this, do you believe demilitarization of the police force is depriving departments of tools that they could use to defend themselves? And also, rather than the federal government deciding, should it be states and the local departments deciding how to best address their situation?
I guess I would argue that we have not yet really demilitarized anybody. We have debated it, and there's some like myself who have said Keene, New Hampshire doesn't need a tank, or a mine-resistant ambush vehicle that's like 27 tons for a town of 500 people. So I think we've gone too far. I think that the surplus weaponry we gave out 27,000 bayonets. We're not going to use bayonets in our cities, And if you talk to generals and I think thoughtful police, they will tell you there's a difference between fighting a war and being police. Police is a much more difficult job. War's difficult sometimes too because of the rules of engagement, restraining our soldiers. But police is really, really hard because you go into a combat zone every day, but virtually everybody's an American citizen. They have rights, and you have to make sure they're actually, actively committing a crime before you use violence against them. Policeman's a difficult job. So would I have sophisticated weapons? Yes, absolutely. For example, and people misconstrued this whole thing like about drones. I had this big, long speech against drones one time. It really wasn't about drones. It was about the Bill of Rights. So for example, if your sister is kidnapped and being held by a kidnapper at gunpoint, would I allow a drone to go through the window and kill the kidnapper? Absolutely. But do I want a drone to drop a bomb on so-and-so who has an Arab name who lives in Dearborn, Michigan, and he sends emails to his cousin in Lebanon? Do I want to drop a drone on him? No. I mean, that's a terrible world. You can imagine if we're going to drone people who somehow might be tangentially connected to a terrorist, maybe. So it's really about the Bill of Rights and the process, not so much the weapon. But there are certain weapons that really aren't as appropriate. Shields and stuff like this for bombs. There's all kinds of sophisticated equipment I would be for. Bayonets I'm not really for. And tanks and mine-resistant vehicles, I think, go too far. And there might be rare occasion for stuff like that, but for the most part, police are different and they have a tough job, but I think that we really don't want, we were always different. And I know terrorism has made it get worse here, but we didn't have so many people walking around with semi-automatic weapons all the time, on the streets. And now we have more of that, we have them in the airports and everywhere else. And it's a tough job, but I think we have to be careful to always remember there's a difference between being police and army.
Thank you.
Senator Paul, my name is Dion Sheehan, and I'll be attending Stanford University. I was wondering...
You couldn't get it anywhere else? Just joking, that's a compliment.
Thank you. For someone interested in participating in government, would you recommend or advise, first having a career in the private sector?
I lean that direction, and that's where I came from. I practiced medicine for about 20 years. But I'm not saying it's necessarily that everybody's the same, but if people ask me my advice, that would be my advice. Have a career, succeed in it, and then, run for office at some point in time. It's also a little easier financially if you try to get to where you're a little more financially solvent before you go right into it, because you don't really get rich in public office, In fact, it's a struggle sometimes. So, but I like the idea of having a career. I think you get another perspective too. Like in Washington, we don't have that many businessmen or women. As a handful in the Senate, but I think they bring an important perspective that is, not so legalistic, but more based in, what do we need? How's regulation killing our economy and our businesses and driving them overseas? So I kind of tend in that direction to have a career first. Particularly if you live in Kentucky, that way I won't have to face you in the next election.
I'm Connor McCormack from Hopkinsville Community College in Kentucky. My question is pretty simple. What is America's greatest accomplishment?
I think one of the things that when you look back to our revolution that really distinguishes us and really I think leads to our greatness in one way is the idea of meritocracy. But not just that it's based on merit. You could probably argue that, since feudal times that people had merit may have risen higher. But if you lived in Europe before our revolution, really you had to almost be of royal blood or lineage. So you got 5 or 10% of the people. And I think this is one of the most remarkable things that happened in our country. And Barbara Tuchman is a historian. She writes about this a little bit. But we came over and for the first time, not just royalty, but everybody. So before advancement and progress of the world was like 10% of the people and occasionally a commoner or occasionally a poor person. Now all of a sudden it expands. That was imperfect. Blacks were excluded from it for the first 100 years or so or 80 years or so. And then women were excluded from it. But each time we've expanded, and we are progressing, technologically and in many ways, but some of it's because we've expanded the group of people we go to. We now have African Americans, we now have women. And then I think the next stage, and this is what I think the next stage in sort of development and productivity for the world, is that when education reaches into the far reaches. And I think it can through the internet. But I guarantee you there are still people, and I don't want to name any countries to disparage them, but there are some countries in the far reaches that are never going to learn calculus or physics or astronomy. But there are smart kids, but we're not getting them. And there's somewhere, the internet now can find them. And I think that's what's going to happen in education. And to a certain extent, even in our state, in Kentucky, there are people in rural parts of our state. Think about it. If you go to a high school that has 30 people in your graduating class, there's no way there's a calculus class. Because there's only be about one kid in every 30 that can do calculus or physics. So you go to a bigger school, there's going to be a calculus class. But there's no reason why if you live in a town of 2,000, you go to that school and you're the bright kid, that you couldn't be learning calculus on the internet. And that's the one thing I think our federal control of education has prevented. So I would say the opening up of meritocracy to a wider group of people in the United States, not just royal, was probably one of the most amazing things about the beginning of our republic and our success.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Patrick O from the University of Texas at Austin. So addressing your point on healthcare, currently hospitals in America have to treat stabilize individuals in emergency situations, and if they're uninsured, it puts an unfair burden that's not paid onto the insured market. So why, in your opinion, should individuals not have a mandate to buy insurance if they are putting an unfair burden on individuals that have insurance and they reap all the benefits from the insurance market?
The history of medicine in our country, and I think in some other countries, was that we it gets back to rights versus obligation, that we do have an obligation to take care of our fellow man. So when you are a physician in a hospital, it's actually called privileges. So I have a privilege to operate at a couple of hospitals in my town. But along with the privilege, I sign a contract, and I'm not sure if it's actually written, but there is a contract. I can't continue to work there unless I see people, anybody that comes in through the emergency room. Now, there's a law now that says it, but it happened way before then, too. I mean, since the beginning of American medical history, we've been seeing people that don't have any money. And you say, well, it's a transfer of cost. Yes, it's probably always been that way a little bit. But the difference is, and what we're getting to, is a society where those who come in have an expectation and they have no belief that they owe anything for the service. We've discounted the service of our medical providers. Most physicians from previous decades will tell sort of quaint stories of people bringing them in things in exchange, for helping them, but they really appreciated it. But sometimes you'll see people for free in the emergency room, you'll ask them to come to the office the next day and you'll say, in order to try to help cover our costs, you need to bring $10. And they come in a new truck with cigarettes, but they're not willing to pay $10 to see a doctor because we've discounted the value of it. Now you say, well, there are poor people that have no money. There are going to be some of that too, and there's always going to be some cost shifting. I guess the question is, do you want to have a small number that don't pay or a large number? Well, obviously we want a small number. So if 95% of the people pay and 5% don't, the transfer to help the 5% gets built into insurance, and I think we can handle it. If it's 60-40 or if it's 50-50, you got a problem. And that's sort of the problem we're running into. And you say, well, why shouldn't we mandate insurance? Believe in coercion? Do you believe you tell your fellow man to do it? People say, we coerce them for other things. We force them to have car insurance. But I guess my mind is that for the most part, free people can come up with solutions without coercion. And you also might have to say people have to pay. And if they don't pay, they will be billed, and there'll be an expectation of payment. There are other ways to fix it as well. You could also say that people are not willing to pay really shouldn't have the right to sue the doctors in the hospital. More lawsuits come from non-payers than payers, which disrupts the system as well. But there'll always be some transfer. You just want to make it minimal. And so it's like anything else. In your community, do you want to have 5% of people on welfare or 50%? So we got to figure out is how to have a robust economic engine that has 5%. And really, when you get to 5%, sometimes you're getting to basically full employment. I came from a county in Kentucky today has 3.7% unemployment. That's pretty good. You know what the #1 complaint of businesses in Kentucky? I visited probably 40 businesses in the last year who employ over 100 people. #1 complaint is they cannot find enough people to work. They're short of labor, but they cannot specifically find enough people who are drug-free and have work ethic. That's a problem. And we have to figure out how to help people without hurting them. And it's big heart, small brain. I'll give you one quick example, and then we're going to finish up. But I can't resist on this. Unemployment insurance. If you're compassionate, you'd want to give people unemployment insurance. Well, there's a tax, and it's paid up to about 26 weeks. But we're in a recession. Should we give them more? So Democrats are always more. We don't care what it costs. So we got to 99 weeks. Well, economists studied this, and you talk about sort of moral constitutional arguments versus an efficiency argument. Here's your argument. They studied employment patterns of hiring people. So if you're the boss and 2 workers come in, they're absolutely identical, but one's been out of work 3 weeks and one's been out of work 99 weeks, guess who gets picked? Every time. The 3-week out of work person. And so by being so generous, you got them away from the workforce so much. You were well intended. It's like so many policies. Obamacare, it's well intended, but it isn't working. We didn't think through the consequences of it. And that's probably one of the most important lessons of public policy, where we make so many mistakes. We don't think through the unintended consequences of it. But you could mandate a lot of things, purchase of insurance and get it to work. But then the question is, where do you stop the mandates? Where do you stop telling people what they have to do? I would rather say if there are some imperfections, let's help people through charity. Or if there has to be a welfare department, I'd rather have it in Bowling Green, and I'd rather have someone who reviews things. I'll tell you a great charity. There's one called Helping Hands in Christ. And you know what? They don't give any cash to anybody. Nobody touches any money, but you come in, and if you're having trouble paying your utility bill, they sit down with you and they give you advice on how to deal with your bills, and then they will write a check or send a money transfer to the utility company. You can have compassion that's constructive. So I think we ought to always look for the choice that involves less coercion, is what I would say. Last question.
Hello, Senator. My name is Benjamin Schrader. I go to Texas A&M University. I want to thank you for letting me take a selfie with you earlier. And
all right. Well, we got Aggies, but no Aggie jokes, right?
Oh, no, sir, but dig them. I wanted to ask you, what was your inspiration to get involved in politics?
My father. I grew up in a political family, and I probably went to 1,000 of his speeches or more. I listened to his interviews. I was really interested in it from a young age. I went to more barbecues than you can imagine, and picnics, and knocked on doors. But I was interested in it as a kid. I came up here in high school as an intern and worked as a volunteer intern in the office and some in college. And then, I spent a lot of time becoming a physician, practiced medicine, but I always kind of dabbled in it. And somebody was asking ways to get involved. when we were in Durham and I was in my residency, we just started our own tax group, my wife and I. And she said, how can we do that, just us? And I said, I don't know, let's try. And so, but we started raiding the state legislature, developed a group, and we were on the local TV and in the newspaper within about 6 months, because we just got active and nobody really was raiding the state legislature, and we decided we'd give them a rating based on their tax votes. I think my dad was a big influence in it, and I grew up in a political family and just had a big appetite for it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, sir.